All right, everybody, welcome back. This is the final video of the review playlist for AP Human Geography and Bear's Guide 205, focusing today on Unit 7. Now, I know that if you're watching this now after 2021, you're probably a little confused because College Board definitely mixed up Unit 6 and Unit 7, but between these two videos, you should have just about everything you need between Unit 6 and Unit 7. So let's jump into it. Now, Unit 7 is all about cities. First, we have to talk about early cities and where did cities originate from, or this idea of settlements, right? Now, urbanization begins where we have agriculture because you have to have a steady supply of food before you can start, building settlements and civilization. So, major areas with river valleys where we saw agriculture is where we're going to see the first urban hearths. Now, you have to know these urban hearths tied to the countries and the rivers. And remember, they're all based around rivers because that's where you have an agricultural surplus after the Neolithic Revolution, right? That starts the demographic transition model. Eventually, we go through this and we stop being an agrarian society and you get to industrialization because of that river. Then you're using that same river to move stuff in industrialization and eventually developing into a service based economy. But how do you define a city? And that's a really tough thing to do. And one thing we need to understand is that cities are tough to define. Is it an agglomerated settlement where citizens or people are primarily engaged in non-agricultural activities, or is it just a built-up area with a certain population? And the thing is, it's kind of a mix. But the most important thing to understand is that we do define cities by the amount of people they have in their size, if everything is connected, and exactly what is happening in that city. And generally, what's happening in that city is a service based economy. Now, governments determine the legal minimum size of cities, and that also makes this confusing because there's all these different types of governments. So, city is a very complex term, right? Not only are we looking at in the size of the structure of the city when defining these settlements, but the functionality of it. What is actually happening in these places? So now here's a bunch of vocab that you might encounter on the AP exam or anywhere for you to understand. So an urbanized area is the city and its suburbs. It is both. So whenever you get any questions about the expansion of urbanization or the expansion of the urban area, it is also including those suburbs. City, an urban settlement that is legally incorporated, independent, self-governing unit. You need to know metropolitan area or metropolis, just the cities and its surrounding areas. And then megacities. These came up in some of the FRQs. Understand the difference between a megacity and a world city, right? And primate cities. Understanding those differences because they'll throw these vocab words at you fast, and you might miss a multiple choice question because you read megacity instead of world city or vice versa. Here are a list of megacities, and I'm sure they've gone up over time. And just looking at it again, once again, there should be a trend here that you see. Definitely in the developing world, do we have more megacities? Which then asks the question, does more developed equal more urban? And no, it doesn't, because the more developed countries are not more urbanized than the developing world. In fact, urbanization is booming in the developing world, and they're urbanizing at a faster rate than the developed world because we have moved on to suburbanization. So when we talk about city structures and we're talking about urbanization, there are actually theories on how to build or how to arrange our cities. Now, each of these models explain how the city should be arranged based on definitely time period when these theories were made, also the sectors of employment and overall development of countries. Also have to know these three models: Latin American model, African model, and Galactic City model. There was also another model that popped up from College Board, the Southeast Asian model. I don't cover that in this video, but very similar to the Latin American or African model in the fact that these models were generated post-colonialism. So they're going to have similar characteristics, but we'll talk about that as we go through them. So the first one's the Burgess or the concentric ring model. It has the central business district in the center, and then as you move out along these rings, the houses get nicer. So essentially, closer to the central business district, you're going to have the manufacturing there. You're going to have poor people there, the recent immigrants there, light industry, because these are where these jobs that the migrants wanted from around the world, these Fordist jobs that they could come and do, because this model was generated after like industrialized Chicago when we still had light industry and we were still manufacturing in the United States. This is pre-deindustrialization of the 1950s. Then we move on to the Hoyt or the sector model, once again made up around the same time, also made about the same city, Chicago. But in this one, instead of rings, what we get are sectors or wedges. And it's that all levels of income have access to the central business district because that's where all the services are. So rich people don't have to drive through the poor neighborhoods don't have to drive through rich neighborhoods, the middle class all get access to it, the central business district, so on and so forth. As I mentioned, both are based on Chicago or models of Chicago, and both are based around the central business district. Now, in the Harrison-Ullman model or the multiple nuclei model, we are not going to focus around a single central business district. In this one, this model is different because there are multiple points of focus within the city that make money or provide services, right? It's not just the central business district. Now, this is a model that is definitely going to be later down the road from our previous two models because this one has more of the services involved. So we're starting to see a post-deindustrialization city in these developed countries with this model. Then we move to our galactic city model, which this is a model that is based purely on a post-industrial or deindustrialized society. We are not manufacturing anything anymore, and everything outside of the central business district is the suburbs now. We are no longer looking at different levels of housing, it's all just suburbs. And because we have the suburbs and everybody's moved out to the suburbs, in this model you have a transportation route to connect everything with a beltway around the city that takes you to important places, services outside of the central business district. And what you really need to understand is the beltway in this that ties everything together, and that this is a model after the deindustrialization, and we're not living in the central business district anymore. We've decided to all move out to the suburbs, and services have followed to start creating edge cities. Now, what we just looked at were three examples of American cities. And in American cities, we have the trend that the rich live out in the suburbs because generally rich people don't want to live in the central business district. Now, obviously, that's not true for all Americans. Remember, this is just a trend. This is just a pattern because we know that people do like to live inside of the cities. We know that there are very famous cities that people like to live in. But for the most part, no one lives there permanently. Everybody eventually moves out to the suburbs. And that's generally what we try to achieve. Whereas in Europe, it's flipped. The lower income people generally live out in the suburbs, and the richer people tend to keep themselves inside the cities. And this is due to how we suburbanize or urbanize our cities. In America, we did urban sprawl. We built wherever we wanted, and we had our cars and highways. So it was easy for us to be, the individuals that we are, to just go and drive into the city and then leave and go back home. Whereas in Europe, they established these things called green belts where they're going to clump the suburbs together. Because they're lower income people, they can't rely on cars and highways. They have the public transportation to take them into the central business district to do jobs and then commute back out to those green belts. And once again, this comes from the American reliance on the car and urban sprawl, the reason why we have our suburbs the way they are, and Europe is the reliance on the train and green belts for their suburbs. Which then takes us to the Latin American city models. Now, the models that we're going to talk about here are of colonized places by Europe. So if we just saw that Europe prefers to have people with wealth and money near the central business district, we see this reflected in the city models of places that were colonized. So what we see in the Latin American model, what you really need to take from this is where the central business district is and where the rich residences are, and it's along that spine. That's where all the services are, the high-end services. That's where jobs are. That's where the rich people live. And then you have these rings, and then by the time you get to the outside ring, you have the squatter settlements. So what are squatter settlements, right? We know that in the developing world, people are moving from rural to urban migration, right? They're moving to the cities either to find manufacturing jobs that could potentially be in the cities. They're moving to these cities, these big cities, for service sector jobs. Maybe they can find, jobs working in hotels with ecotourism, working in hotels, maintenance, cleaning, serving food, whatever it may be. There's job opportunities here, but when they're moving to this big city, they can't afford to find a place to live within the city. So they basically just take over some land that the government doesn't want. They use materials, whatever they can find, and they build housing along that edge. So know the spine, the elite residential sector, and the squatter settlements, and how we get squatter settlements. Then we have the sub-Saharan African city model, which in this I haven't marked with 2 central business districts, but I saw an FRQ yesterday from College Board that said it has 3 central business districts. So what you should really take from this is that, and I guess they're counting the market zone as an informal central business district, but the idea is that this is a place, this is a city model that has attributes because of colonization. We have rings that people live around one of the central business districts. Obviously, there was one established by colonial times, probably for an export-oriented economy. And once again, those squatter settlements along the outside ring, because you have people migrating to these cities in hopes of finding services, in hopes of finding jobs to make some money. Now, I brought up the Southeast Asian model earlier, which I don't have that model in any type of form, but experiencing the same thing. The central business district is along the coast in places where there's services and money and export-oriented economies. And then along the peripheral, the urban periphery, we have squatter settlements. So very similar to the sub-Saharan African city model or Latin American model in basic structure. As I mentioned with the sub-Saharan, you have people living in the center. The people that live closer to the central business districts are generally higher income people with more money, and the outer ring are those squatter settlements. So when we talk about urbanization, right, we're talking about these cities being built and the surrounding suburbs, and we have to look at urbanization and suburbanization differently based on where we are. We're going to analyze it in the developing world and in the developed world, because remember, in the developing world they are very much building their cities, and in the developed world we have moved past that and moved to this. And what we see because of urbanization sometimes is this thing called megalopolises, where our urban areas run into each other and it just creates a giant urban area, a continuous urban area. And that's just this definition here, and it's because of urban sprawl, which eventually makes these megalopolises. Now, you have to know that there are a couple megalopolises in the United States, the biggest one being the Boswash Corridor, and the largest one in the world being the Tokyo-Yokohama megalopolis in Japan. You also have to know, random vocab, gateway cities. These cities act as a gateway to another area, totally metaphorical or symbolic. Now let's talk about urbanization in the developing world. This obviously is an effect of colonialism, right? We know that in colonialism, it set up these colonies to be export-oriented because the colonizer wanted to steal these resources, take these resources for themselves, and it sets up this core-periphery relationships with LDCs, that the core or the periphery counts on the core, the periphery being the old colonized country, and the core being the countries that take everything, but now they're buying. Now, these old systems, once they're no longer colonized, well, they have these ports that are exporting things, and these countries go, well, why don't we keep doing this? So you have, these export-oriented economies start to build along the coast. These cities start to build because we progress over time. And then, of course, because there's no jobs in the periphery and there's a high birth rate due to traditional roles of agriculture and so on and so forth, we see a massive amount of rural to urban migration. And this really jumpstarts the urbanization process in the developing world. You just have massive amounts of people migrating to these locations that were critical during times of colonialism, and now they're a place of opportunity. And this is how we create primate cities. This is how we create mega cities in the developing world, because everybody's just moving there. And looking at the models that we just looked at, we know where in the cities they're moving to. So it's going to be a massive amount of squatter settlements. Now, on the topic of squatter settlements, there are different names for them. Favelas are the most well-known ones in Brazil. And if you remember any of these, I would remember those. Now remember, squatter settlements are illegal housing. This is on land that's not zoned for housing by those cities. These cities don't want people living on this land because it's probably not good land to live on. There's no infrastructure there. There's no plumbing. There's no electricity. There's no public services. There's no roads. There's no infrastructure. There aren't services. This could be in land that has toxic waste. This could be on land that's just a dump. This could be on dangerous land that could suffer from, mudslides. But it doesn't matter because when you are a migrant and you're trying to escape poverty, you will live wherever you can. So, squatter settlements are caused by a massive amount of people, as I mentioned, in the developing world, moving from rural to urban in the search of jobs, right? They want something either in the primary sector, secondary sector, or tertiary sector. All jobs are available at this point in these cities, and they are just trying to find something. But there are consequences of moving all these people to these areas. The fact is, it is unsanitary and unhealthy. These houses are built on land that's just not a good place to be, especially if there's trash, if there's waste. You see an increase in crime and drugs because it can't be regulated by police. And you have an increase in pollution, erosion, urban sprawl, definitely because you just have these houses being built anywhere. And it's not like these houses are built out of materials that are safe or that came from a safe place. Remember, these people are trying to build housing with anything they can find, which then leads to an increased risk of disaster damage because you are putting tons of people together in very shaky housing or not very stable housing. So if something were to happen, it dramatically increases the disaster damage. Earthquakes are more dangerous, mudslides are more dangerous, fires are more dangerous, pandemics are more dangerous. And then, of course, that leads to a strain on the city because the city wants to fix these things and the city wants to make sure that these people are taken care of because when they're not taken care of, they're just going to go to the city and put a strain on their services to help them. So how do they get them water? How do they get them electricity? How do they get them social services? Now, what cities can do to kind of offset these primate cities or these mega cities that generate these big squatter settlements and concentrate the economy in these couple of cities that could potentially be damaging if something happens to them, countries can either have a forward capital where they will move their capital to the inside of their country, moving it away from the coastal regions, moving it away from the core economic parts of the country to try and get people to follow into the periphery and build the periphery. Although sometimes it can also be a planned capital that they'll move their capital, countries will move their capital for more of a show of importance, wealth, and power, not so much as a practical reason trying to get people to move. So now let's switch gears and talk about suburbanization and urbanization in the developed world. We know that because of urbanization in the developing world, it's created primate cities, it's created these big cities, mega cities. But what has happened in the developed world, especially the United States? Well, after the 40s and 50s and World War II, we have deindustrialization. We're not doing the factory thing anymore, and tons of people are moving out to the suburbs. Now, why are we moving out to the suburbs? Because we have the highways now, so people can live in the suburbs and commute to the city for their job. After World War II, tons of people have more money than ever before, so people are buying houses and cars. We have a manufacturing boom, so more houses can be built, more cars can be built, more stuff can be built, so everybody wants to buy stuff. And then, of course, we have a baby boom. And when we have a baby boom, those people want to raise their kids in places that are quiet with better schools, more space, and less crime, so of course they're going to move out to the suburbs. It's nicer out there. There's more space. You can have a nice white picket fence, 2 kids and a dog. But the only people that got to move out to the suburbs were white people, and obviously this had a huge effect on the cities and racial disparities in the United States, and what is popularly termed as white flight. Now, because of this, it creates some inner city problems. And now we're in the 60s and 70s talking about American cities. So you have all of these people moving out to the suburbs, and predominantly white people. Did black people move out to the suburbs? Yes. Did Hispanic people move out to the suburbs? Absolutely. But overwhelmingly, it was white people. And the people that were trapped inside the cities because they were not offered loans, because they did not have a way out, started to suffer the issues of these inner city problems, right? We experienced deindustrialization. We're no longer manufacturing. So in all of our cities across the United States, we're shutting down factories, which is the main source of jobs for people. We have depopulation in these cities, mostly due to white flight because people moving out to the suburbs. So if you don't have jobs in cities and you don't have people in cities, you lose tax revenue, you see spikes in unemployment, You see spikes in crime because people need to survive. And then those surrounding businesses cannot meet their thresholds, right? They don't have enough customers, so all the services leave. So this really destroys our cities in the US. And what we see because of this is ghettoization. And it clumps people together in these cities with no services available, no jobs available, no tax revenue available to build infrastructure or to provide jobs. So really it leaves people with nothing trapped in these places. Now, ghettoization can sometimes occur, and the trapping of people while predominantly white people are fleeing to the suburbs. How are people of color trapped inside the cities, disproportionately black Americans? Well, first, we have redlining, drawing on lines on a map to identify areas in which banks refuse to loan money. Now, this is illegal, but in the past, and this was done by the government, redlining and greenlining places where they would give loans and where they wouldn't give loans. And predominantly, disproportionately in redlined areas were people of color, so they could not get loans to move out to the suburbs. Then we see blockbusting, where real estate agents encourage white property owners to sell their homes at a loss because they're saying, whoa, you see these people moving in, referring to people of different race, ethnic, or religious backgrounds to try and basically scare them through racism to leave the cities. So they sell their homes that are inside these cities. And what they do with them is filtering. They cut them up and they don't sell them, because if you sell them, then people can, buy them and get property value and make money. What they end up doing is cutting up these large homes into smaller apartments and renting them out to the people who are trapped inside the cities, right? So now these people in the cities are spending all their money on rent, they're losing their jobs, and they're trying to survive whatever they can. And because everything is leaving, these houses that were once very beautiful, that are being rented out, are turning into slums because they're becoming dilapidated over time, because there's no money in these areas, there's no services in these areas, so landlords don't feel the need to make these houses any nicer. So how do we fix this, right? And fix is in quotations because it's fixing a problem we have created that ultimately, when we try to fix, creates more problems. First, gentrification. The act of private citizens, generally middle or upper class people, moving into a low class area and fixing it up. The new trend now is to move back into these cities and see this cool architecture that used to exist. And the idea is, wow, there's so much potential in this area to make it look good and bring back people. Now, usually the people that are gentrifying are usually overwhelmingly white and middle class, but definitely young people moving into an area, bringing services that they want. Hip bars, galleries, restaurants, and these places do become desirable to live. They have hip services, there's jobs there now, there's cool housing, but the issue is that the people living in these areas that were in these dilapidated houses, or that made this society or community unique in these older houses where they have had to live because they didn't have an option on how to get out, are now forced out. Because as gentrification makes the places nicer, it increases rent on people, it increases property values, and people then are forced out because they can no longer to afford in the neighborhoods that they have lived in for years, because remember, they were forced in the 50s and 60s to live there because there were no other options. So there are pros to gentrification. It does help an area. It does make it desirable and trendy. Crime does decrease, and tax income increases because people are moving into these areas and creating tax revenue for the cities and introducing new services. But the cons is definitely that rent and prices are increased. Poor people are forced out, and we don't know where they're going to go. And historically ethnic neighborhoods that are cool and hip that people want to move to because of that ethnic or culturally unique sense that's there, loses that heritage or sense of place because of these white communities, or overwhelmingly white communities, that are moving in. Now, we also have the City Beautiful movement, where the government will get involved to try and make the cities nicer, and this is more focused on like parks and statues and stuff like that, really just stuff to make it visibly more appealing. And we see this here. But sometimes the government can get involved in gentrification, but it's just not called gentrification when the city does it. Sometimes the government will knock down old properties, pay people to relocate them, and build new housing. And this can also be a solution to gentrification, that the city can come in and build public housing, or they build infrastructure. But this could be bad too, because we have seen when urban renewal happens, like with the highway system, that they knock down predominantly black neighborhoods and force them out of their homes and for highway construction. So it can be good, it can be bad. And generally, too, when the government knocks down this old housing for new housing, it takes away the uniqueness of a place and takes down that history that exists. So, what happens as people move out to the suburbs? When people move out to the suburbs, the retail stores eventually follow them, right? Remember those services that from deindustrialization, they leave the central business district and now they're going to follow people out to the suburbs. And this has happened with retail. And retail has changed. Before, all retail used to be downtown. You used to have to drive into the downtown areas and you would have Main Street and you'd have the stores there that you would visit and you would do your shopping and so on and so forth. Then, as the suburbs happen, we get suburban malls. And if you've ever seen, I can't think of the show on Netflix now, Stranger Things, their most recent season is about the mall in the suburbs, and that's the perfect example of when that used to happen. Then we get our mega stores in the 90s, Walmart, Kmart, and now today we have the internet. But with all these services moving out, eventually it creates this idea that, well, why don't I just stay in the suburbs? My job is in the suburbs. I shop in the suburbs. And now we have like these mini cities in our cities, but what we call them are edge cities, these cities on the outskirts of the central, like way out of the suburbs. And now people don't need to commute into the central business district. They can just live in the suburbs, work in the suburbs, shop in the suburbs, and they live in those suburbs. Which also takes us to now the density gradient. As people are moving out to the suburbs, the density of American cities have changed. Before, everybody used to live near the central business district, but now this has changed to where no one really wants to live in the central business district, and most of us live in the suburbs. But we're not talking about population, total population, we're talking about density. So the density gradient is based on bid rent. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know that there is a lot less available land in the central business district than there is in the suburbs. And because there's not a lot of land available in the central business district, it's going to be very expensive. And because it's very expensive, you're going to have people that live there packed into really, really small apartments and condos compared to the more land you can buy because it's just more available in the suburbs, which means you can have bigger houses. The suburbs has way more people. But notice that in the cities, it's the most dense, but the least amount of people in the central business district. Most dense, least amount of people. Around, you have a spike in density even more because you have even more people packed together. And then in the suburbs, you have the least dense, but the most people. A couple other vocab words you got to know, just some random stuff. Brought this up randomly. College Board likes to include these when we're talking about cities. Something to keep in mind. And that's about everything you need to know for Unit 7. One thing I know I forgot to mention was this topic of new urbanism and mixed-use land use. So I want to bring this up at the very end, and I'm sorry there's nothing here. But the idea with new urbanism, because this came up on an FRQ a while ago. It's a new trend in building cities where we are going to reduce the size of roads because we want to go away from driving cars everywhere and focus more on people walking. We're also going to start combining the different types of structures that we have. We want to combine residential and commercial property together so people can walk around and access multiple things in one place, generally in near cities or the central business district. Now, this creates a mixed use land use pattern. And what we want to think about is why cities would want to switch to this new urbanism or mixing the use of our land. And really, it's to cut down on the use of cars, the use of traffic, maybe move towards a slow growth, like an idea of taking pace a life a little bit slower. But the environmental impact is huge here because we're reducing cars, we're reducing urban sprawl, we're able to concentrate people into cities, and we're able to give more room for agriculture and preserve that environment. So I know that was thrown at you last minute, and I really apologize for that. But if you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment. And if you have any questions, make sure to write it in your notebook. As always, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you know when new videos drop. As always, this is Bear's Guide to a 5. I'll see you next time.